All right, well, let's get a few questions here, Jim. This next one was sent to CornyDriveThru. This first one was sent to CornyDriveThru@gmail.com from Dan Pradis in Rosedale, Maryland.
I can't believe that's the way his name is pronounced.
I'm a huge fan of the podcast. If you have to rate all the pro wrestlers from past and present, who in your mind would be the Babe Ruth of wrestling?
Well, and you're a bigger baseball aficionado than I am. So, of course, I do know that Babe Ruth was not the first great Hall of Fame baseball player, but he was the... So what would you liken him, since it was the same era? Would you maybe think that Strangler Lewis would have been the Babe Ruth of professional wrestling? Or would it have been somebody like Gotch, the first big major national mainstream celebrity type of thing?
See, if you're going based on era, then you have to compare it to wrestlers of that era. But I think the Babe Ruth of wrestling, the Babe Ruth as opposed to Babe Ruth, means something. It's not just the biggest star. Babe Ruth was the biggest star who elevated the entire game of baseball. He hit more home runs than entire teams had previously hit. He brought more fans to the game when they needed it after the Black Sox scandal of 1919. He was one of the first athletes to be mass merchandised, to be on various items, to have his face and his image all over the place. So I think when you're looking at it...
Then would it be Londos?
That was the person I was thinking of, was Jim Londos.
Because Londos, even though Lewis was the real deal, Londos was more popular, definitely bigger at the gate, more mainstream, had the matinee idol looks, did merchandise. His, name was on posters and products and things because he was one of the biggest sports celebrities in the United States in the, from the mid-20s to the mid-30s. So, yeah, maybe that would, as you've given me more context on Babe Ruth, maybe Londos would be the wrestling equivalent.
I think so. I think that would be the person I would pick. I think would be Jim Londos.
And then you'd put Gotch more in line with like Honus Wagner.
Yeah, I mean something like that actually probably does work. But before we wrap up this topic, Jim, we still do hear from people who say we hear you guys talk about Jim Londos. You guys have mentioned him and said he's the biggest drawing card in history of the wrestling business. You said all these things about him. Alan Blackstock the other day, and he's pretty influential on Twitter with wrestling fans and people in the business, quite frankly. I think he tweeted out, people sometimes forget Jim Londos was only 5'8". Yeah. So there are a lot of things people don't know about him, especially our audience and a lot of the younger listeners. What can you say about Jim Londos and his role as someone who a lot of us consider to be the biggest wrestling star ever?
Well, now also he was 5'8", but he probably, and especially you see those pictures with that wide chest, he was definitely over 200 pounds. So for people thinking, well, he's the same size as Adam Cole,
No,
it's the way you're arranged differently.
Back then, wrestlers actually trained in wrestling, so usually they had, usually they were in a certain shape. It usually wasn't guys that looked like Adam Cole out there.
Yeah, and because weight training was in its infancy in those days, and training methods in general, guys didn't have Mr. Universe bodybuilder physiques, but most of the guys were not only, in shape for wrestling, but also credible in size and weight proportionately, etc. However, anyway, the reason why that we always say Londos, and it's not like we're making this up, almost everybody agrees, it's done any amount of research, Londos was the number one attraction at the gate in wrestling for a longer period of time, more years, than anybody else that has ever occupied that position. He lasted twice as long at the top as Hulk Hogan, 5 times as long at the top as Steve Austin. And also the idea that a guy could sell tickets like that in the Depression. And they weren't expensive tickets, but still in the Depression, everything was expensive because 25% of the country was out of work. Then you take into account there were not only no interstate highways, but there weren't even a lot of reliable roads in a lot of states paved to begin with in the 20s and 30s, when Londos and his main event matches are filling up baseball stadiums in New York and in Boston. And not only that, but he drew huge crowds on several different occasions. And we've seen some of the film. I think Alan has tweeted some of that, because he was Greece. He was a national hero in Greece. Or he was Greek. He was Greece. He was Greek, so he was a national hero in Greece. And at the Olympic Stadium there, he had matches in front of what's reported to be, and the video film footage kind of backs it up, over 100,000 people. He was on top in the 20s, and he was still a name when TV came in. He was just tailing his career off in the early 50s. I mean, for the amount of record gates and the amount of ballpark crowds and the amount of time that he spent as the top attraction in wrestling and the amount of time he spent as world champion and the, impact he had in the newspapers and sports magazines of the time, where he was treated with similar column space and headline material with the world boxing champion. And this was before football players, baseball players, basketball players, anybody made anywhere near the amount of money of boxers and wrestlers. I would imagine that fucking racehorses in those days made more money than football and basketball and baseball players.
Yeah.
So for all of those reasons, and that's another reason why that, it'll never be duplicated. Nobody can ever be that big and dominate the business by that amount of a margin for that long with that kind of publicity and draw crowds like that ever again. Nobody's at Bruno's at, what is he? A 6th or 7th or 8th on the box office list. Nobody's going to top him. Bill Longson, he's number 4. Nobody's ever going to top that or him. Again, it's not going to be possible. So, right now, the only additions going forward to the box office attraction all-time list are going to be whoever the WWE decides to use on top. And it might not even necessarily be because of them. It's just they're the only ones that are going to be on shows in front of crowds that big. And still, it's not going to be for anywhere near the longevity that guys like Longson and Londos and Lewis and Bruno and Rogers and Thez had. It's just never going to be possible to top any of their records ever again.